From Chicago studios, this is the Muslim News on Muslim Network TV. Assalamu alaikum, I'm Samana Siddiqui. First, the headlines. 10,000 Muslims are dead in Ukraine. Biden says butcher Putin cannot remain in power. Amnesty calls denial of bail for Indian Muslim activist big blow. Palestinian president tells Blinken about Western double standards on Ukrainian versus Palestinians. Biden tax plan would force top 10 billionaires to pay $215 billion over next decade. Uninsured Americans will now be charged $125 for a single PCR COVID-19 test. Our top story tonight. Ukraine's Muslim community estimates that 10,000 Muslims have died in the Russian aggression so far. A Muslim group with historical ties to Ukraine spoke about the toll amid escalating violence. The Manitoba Islamic Association in Canada hosted a virtual discussion with President of the Muslim Council of Ukraine, Sheikh Seyran Arifov, in Lviv on Sunday. Idris al-Bakri, a member of the association's board of directors, said Ukraine is home to an ancient Muslim community. The first documented emergence of Islamic culture in Ukraine came in the 19th century. But Ukraine's southern region of Crimea was once governed by Tatars. Arifov, who is of Tatar ancestry, estimates there were about 1.5 million Muslims living in Ukraine before Russia's invasion. U.S. President Joe Biden on Saturday called Russia's war on Ukraine a strategic failure for Moscow. Biden spoke during a two-day visit to the Polish capital of Warsaw, Ukraine's largest neighbor directly to the west. After calling Russian President Vladimir Putin a butcher earlier Saturday, Biden predicted Russia's latest war will end in its defeat. He ended his remarks by saying Putin cannot remain in power. Later, a White House official attempted to clarify the president's remark, downplaying any suggestion that Biden was encouraging regime change in Russia. Regarding economic sanctions on Russia, Biden said Russia soon will drop out of the list of the world's top 20 economies. He also said Russians are not the enemy. A local source said a military convoy carrying logistics for the U.S.-led coalition against ISIS came under attack in southern Iraq on Sunday. On condition of anonymity, the source said a roadside bomb exploded as the convoy was moving on a highway near the city of Nasiriyah. A military vehicle sustained minor damage in the attack, but no injuries were reported. The U.S.-led coalition of Iraqi authorities made no comments about the report. In recent months, there have been a spate of attacks targeting U.S.-led coalition convoys in central and southern Iraq. Washington has accused Iran-backed Iraqi groups of being behind the attacks, which Tehran denies. On Sunday, women's rights activists pledged to launch a wave of protests across Afghanistan if the Taliban failed to reopen girls' schools within a week. Thousands of secondary school girls flocked to classes Wednesday after the Taliban reopened schools for the first time since seizing power last August. But officials ordered the schools shut again just hours into the day, triggering international outrage. Activist Halima Nasri, representing 4 women's rights groups, warned if schools remained closed after 1 week, they would open them themselves and stage demonstrations nationwide. The group's statement said the Taliban should be building more schools for girls in rural areas rather than shutting existing facilities. The move comes after several women's activists were detained in recent months. The rector of a Paris mosque said a rise in anti-Islam rhetoric in the French presidential election campaign risks creating a spiral of hatred. Shamsuddin Hafiz, the rector of Paris's historic Grande Mosquée, said law-abiding Muslims are being scapegoated just like Jews were vilified in the 1930s. He also said French society is weakened and fearful after the pandemic. Hafiz published a book this month entitled With All Due Respect, We Are Children of the Republic. He wrote it to counter heightened anti-Muslim rhetoric in the run-up to France's April 10th election. French President Emmanuel Macron is leading the polls and favored to win re-election. Rival candidates have focused on Islam and immigration. Amnesty International is describing India's repeated denial of bail to jailed Muslim activist Umar Khalid as a big blow to freedom of expression and peaceful assembly. 34-year-old Khalid, along with more than a dozen other Muslims, is accused of being part of a larger conspiracy that led to religious riots in New Delhi in February 2020. The riots left 53 people dead, most of them Muslims, and dozens of houses and mosques torched. It was the worst spate of violence the Indian capital had seen in decades. The riots followed peaceful sit-ins nationwide, mainly organized by Muslim women, against the passage of the controversial Citizenship Amendment Act in late 2019. Critics say the law, which fast-tracked Indian citizenship for non-Muslim refugees from neighboring nations, violated India's secular constitution. On Sunday, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas criticized the West's double standards, penalizing Russia for invading Ukraine while ignoring Israel's crimes against Palestinians. Abbas shared his frustration with visiting U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken during a briefing with reporters at the Palestinian presidential residence in Ramallah. He said no one is holding Israel responsible, despite the crimes of the Israeli occupation that amounted to ethnic cleansing and racial discrimination. Blinken held talks with Abbas during a trip that included meeting with the foreign ministers of Israel and 4 Arab countries that have normalized relations with the Jewish state. Fitch Ratings reports that Oman's Islamic banking sector is likely to maintain its positive trajectory in the short to medium term despite structural challenges. Increased awareness, strong retail demand for Islamic products, supportive regulations, and a strong push from the Islamic windows of conventional banks will drive growth. Growth in Islamic and conventional banking is also expected to come from the improving operating environment, expected GDP growth, higher oil prices, and easing of COVID restrictions. A rise in interest or profit rates will also support that growth. The Islamic banking sector's growth topped 11.6% year over year in 2021, while the conventional banking sector's finances grew only 3.1% for that same period. We're bringing more news stories after the break, so stay tuned, and we'll be right back after these messages.
If I could be you, and you could be me for just 1 hour. If we could find a way to get inside each other's minds. Walk a mile in my shoes. Walk a mile in my shoes. Well, before you abuse, criticize, and accuse. Walk a mile in my shoes.
Despite the development of a COVID-19 vaccine, millions around the world will not have access. We need a vaccine that's free and available to everyone, everywhere. It's time for a people's vaccine.
There are 16 million children struggling with hunger in America. That's 1 in 5 daughters, sons, neighbors, and classmates who don't know where their next meal is coming from. Yet billions of pounds of good food go to waste every year. It's time we do something about it. Feeding America is a nationwide network of food banks that helps provide meals to millions of kids and families in need. Visit feedingamerica.org to help them feed even more. Together, we can solve hunger. Together, we're feeding America.
Friends, our world is pulling together like never before. We're making huge sacrifices to keep one another safe. Scientists are working non-stop to develop COVID-19 vaccines and treatments. A vaccine will get our economies moving. It will tell our loved ones we're safe again. But we have challenges we must address. Right now, huge pharmaceutical companies are keeping the vaccine research a secret. They're deciding how many vaccines get made, how much to charge for them, and who gets vaccinated. This will no doubt leave billions of people behind. Pharma companies are putting profit, not people, first. Yet, billions of dollars of taxpayers' money is funding their work. We cannot let the CEOs of a handful of pharmaceutical companies decide our future. We need a vaccine that everyone can have free of charge, no matter where you live or whether you're rich or you're poor. We need companies to share all their research so we can make enough safe vaccines for everyone. We need a vaccine owned by all of us. To end this COVID-19 pandemic, we need to pull together once more.
Welcome back. U.S. President Joe Biden said he plans to unveil a 20% minimum tax rate on all American households worth more than $100 million. The so-called billionaires tax specifically targets roughly 700 of the nation's wealthiest people. The Washington Post reports that the proposal could be announced as early as Monday as part of the president's rollout of his 2023 budget. The move was lauded by economic experts and progressives opposed to inequality and the growing wealth gap between the rich and poor in the U.S. Gabrielle Zuckman, Associate Professor of Economics at UC Berkeley and an expert on inequality and taxation, said the Biden plan could have real teeth. With the plan, the top 10 billionaires would pay at least $215 billion in the next 10 years. A major U.S. testing company said this week it will charge uninsured people $125 to receive its COVID-19 PCR test. ABC News reports that Quest Diagnostics, one of the largest testing companies in the country, announced that anyone without Medicare, private coverage, or other insurance will have to pay. Those using Quest Direct PCR tests either by ordering a kit online or visiting one of the 1,500 Quest or major retail locations that administer the tests will be charged. Critics say it's the latest example of how the U.S. remains an outlier among wealthy nations for refusing to provide universal health care for its people. Federal prosecutors said a young man from Maine is accused of plotting to attack a Chicago area mosque. Court documents show that on February 11th, 18-year-old Xavier Pelkey was taken into custody. He has been charged with one count of possession of unregistered destructive devices. CNN reports that an FBI agent said investigators found 3 items in a backpack that appeared to be handmade explosive devices. An initial examination of the items found them to be fireworks taped together with staples, pins, and thumbtacks. The agent said they were designed to increase the amount of shrapnel propelled by an explosion if detonated. A new play entitled The Hijabis, featuring 3 Muslim American women and their life journeys, opens at George Fox University in Oregon at the end of this month. The story follows several Muslim American women as they navigate life's milestones. It was written by Rohina Malik, an acclaimed American playwright, and is directed by Genevieve Fowler, Malik's friend and colleague. Fowler said the women are going through love, loss, big life changes, and also have a unique experience of being women who wear a hijab and all that entails. Judge Adam Shakoor, the attorney who represented Rosa Parks, has died. He was 74. Shakoor died Sunday at St. Mary's Hospital in Livonia, Michigan. Civil rights groups say he was the nation's first Muslim judge. Born in 1947 as Adam Cadell, Shakoor grew up in northeast Detroit's Sojourner Truth public housing complex. He obtained bachelor's, master's, and law degrees from Wayne State University. Cadell embraced Islam during his time at Wayne State and changed his last name to Shakoor. Family members said he advocated for social change and fought for civil rights with a passion for justice and fairness, especially during the 1960s and 70s. Shakoor was appointed judge of the Common Pleas Court for Wayne County by the late Governor William Milliken in 1981. Coming up next after the break is our in-depth analysis segment, so stay tuned, and we'll be right back after these messages.
Assalamu alaikum. This is Imam Malik Mujahid in Chicago. Just like you, I was moved by that Allahu Akbar lady. She stood her ground, fearful of none, for her hijab and for her education. Sisters and brothers, Indian Muslims are facing a genocide. India does not care for Muslim protesting, but it does care for the world opinion. Therefore, we must push the United Nations. The UN has a responsibility to protect. They must prevent genocide. Please sign this UN petition now. Get others to sign. It will help. Trust me, it will help. We need 1 million signatures, brothers and sisters. Please sign now.
Mr. Speaker, if I decide to wear a turban, or you decide to wear a cross, or he decides to wear a kippah or a skull cap, or she decides to wear a hijab or a burqa, does that mean that it is open season for right honourable members of this House to make derogatory and divisive remarks about our appearance? For those of us who from a young age have had to endure and face up to being called names such as Towelhead or Taliban, or coming from Bongo land, we can appreciate full well the hurt and pain felt by already vulnerable Muslim women when they are described as looking like bank robbers and letterboxes. So rather than hide hide behind sham and whitewash investigations? When will the Prime Minister finally apologise for his derogatory and racist remarks? Racist remarks, Mr. Speaker, which have led to a spike in hate crime. And given the increasing prevalence of such incidents within his party, when will the Prime Minister finally order an inquiry into Islamophobia within the Conservative Party, something which he and his Chancellor promised on national television?
Despite the development of a COVID-19 vaccine, millions around the world will not have access. We need a vaccine that's free and available to everyone, everywhere. It's time for a people's vaccine.
Dad, they took over my bedroom. Come on, come on. Okay, Dad. 1, 2, 3. Dad! You saved me. Dad?
Are you okay?
I'm fine, dear.
Your hero needs you now, and AARP is here to help. Find the care guides you need at aarp.org/caregiving.
Welcome back. Now it's time for our in-depth analysis. Let's watch.
Thank you, Samana. Greatly appreciated. Now we'd like to discuss some important economic news. President Biden has laid out a proposal for a new tax plan, a plan that would tax some of the wealthiest billionaires in this country and raise potentially a significant amount of revenue. What exactly does this plan entail? Does it have any chance of passing? Is it a good idea, a bad idea? We'd like to discuss that today with our special guest, Dr. FADHEL KABOUB, who is a professor, an associate professor of economics at Denison University. He also serves as the president of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. We are very happy to have him and his expertise here with us today. Assalamu alaikum, Professor. How are you?
Alaikum salam. Thank you for having me on the show.
Thank you so much for joining us. We greatly appreciate it. So let me start by asking you, what has President Biden proposed? Tell us a little bit about this plan he has laid out, and then we'll get into the fine points of it.
Well, we'll see the details of this proposal apparently on Monday, as soon as Monday, but we already have a little bit of a scoop from some of the media organizations that have seen at least the outline of this proposal. And the main message is that this can potentially raise as much as $215 billion over the next 10 years. So in the bigger scheme of things, when you look at the federal government spending and tax revenues, it's actually small, relatively insignificant. Just to put it in perspective, for example, the infrastructure plan, the climate intervention that many people have been expecting over the last few months, the talk was about $3.5 trillion over the next decade. This is essentially a drop in the bucket in the bigger scheme of things, but it's symbolic and it's meaningful in the sense that we finally have a serious discussion and a proposal at the federal level to tackle the excessive wealth inequality and the power and influence of a very small handful of individuals. And we can debate whether this is going to be effective, sufficient, or not sufficient, but at least we're aiming in the right direction. We're looking at some serious issues that have been boiling in the public discourse, to be honest, since 2008, since the Occupy Wall Street movement, the highlighting and shining a bright light on the issue of inequality in the United States. So finally, a decade or so later, we're beginning that intervention. And we can debate whether it's sufficient, whether it's the right amount and so on, but at least we're moving in the right direction.
So thank you, Professor. Let me ask you this. So you've noted $215 billion, relatively small amount. Our government arguably wastes that much money in a month, or less, I should say. What is your ideal? What do you think, if President Biden had the ability to go further, what do you think he should be doing, and why?
Well, this raises the question of redistribution, which most people think of kind of taxing the rich to spend on government programs, social services, infrastructure, climate change, and all that. So that's the concept of redistribution: tax the rich and give to the poor. I'd like to think of this in terms of pre-distribution. In other words, designing a public policy framework in which the economy functions in a way that actually pre-distributes wealth in the right way in the first place, instead of producing a system that produces so much excessive concentration of wealth and power and influence in the hands of a handful of individuals, and then trying to figure out how are we going to tax it away from them to redistribute some to the poor, some to the other national priorities. So unfortunately, this tax plan that President Biden is about to propose doesn't get us to the question of pre-distribution and redesigning the way we operate the economy in the first place. It's leaving in place a system that's extractive, that's unjust, that produces inequality, and then tries to fix it on the back end by saying, let's take a little bit of this excessive wealth and reorient it towards other things. So for me, one of the ways to start really to truly think of pre-distribution is to take a really serious look at the issue of power, market concentration, market power, antitrust laws, things that we have neglected for almost 100 years. Recognizing that we live in an economy, in a corporate system that has mastered the way of knowing what the rules of the games are and circumventing the rules in ways that don't technically violate antitrust laws. But we all know we have something called big tech. We all know we have something called big pharma, Wall Street, very powerful corporations, very high degrees of market concentration that give them quasi-monopoly power, which is what antitrust laws were supposed to take care of, which means we have a situation where individual corporations in particular industries can accumulate more market power, can raise prices simply because they can, or simply because we let them, can extract so much wealth to the top 1% or 1/10 of 1% in the case of the US, and there's nothing technically illegal about it. And now we're trying to tax some of that excessive wealth away. And of course, because they have so much power and influence in the political system to begin with, it's going to be really hard to actually enforce. And it doesn't mean that there isn't going to be a new series of innovations in creative accounting to circumvent the new rules anyway. So that's really why it's important to start the conversation. It's important to have a goal of addressing this excessive inequality, but it's also important to go to the roots of the problem as opposed to trying to fix it on the back end.
So, Professor, you make an interesting point there. You argue that this concept that you have of kind of addressing the problem before it becomes a problem, one of the ways to do that is through antitrust law, maybe breaking up some of these massive conglomerations that are monopolizing certain sectors of the economy. I mean, to some extent, the president and the Justice Department have the ability to block companies from merging right now. Do you think that President Biden is using that power enough? Do you think there's anything he could be doing without Congress right now to make strides on that antitrust aspect of things? Or do you think the changes you're talking about are so significant and so large it would require legislation to authorize it?
Absolutely. I think it's more in the hands of Congress at this point. The president by himself doesn't have the legal jurisdiction, so to speak, to change, a lot of what we already have on the books, what the legal system has on the books. But there are certain things that need to be addressed here. It's not just antitrust regulations. For example, the issue of wage inequality, the issue of the minimum wage, because what we have here is two ways to squeeze essentially profits and excessive wealth. More of the share of wealth that's been generated can go to workers, or more can go to shareholders, and can go into stock options, and can go into what corporations used to be unable to do and now do excessively, which is stock buybacks. So all of these reforms have to take place in order for us to create a system that predistributes wealth in an equitable and fair and just way, and eliminates the very nature of this excessive wealth generation. I mean, a friend of mine, Professor Stephanie Kelton, has this famous line where she says, every billionaire is a policy failure. It's a policy design that produces this excessive concentration of wealth. If we have the right kind of distribution, the right wage policy, the right regulatory framework for stock buybacks, for distribution of wealth generated by corporations between shareholders and workers, we wouldn't be having this discussion today. We would have pre-distributed wealth that's going into, even and fair distribution between workers and shareholders and capitalists and so on.
Now, Professor, let me ask you this. Some people would push back and say, well, look, hold on. When you try to get into planning out the economy, planning out distribution of wealth, redistribution, preventing people from ever becoming billionaires, what do you say? People argue that, look, if someone has a good idea, if you're a Bill Gates or a Steve Jobs and you have an idea that earns a lot of money, revenue, that's okay. You've earned that money. And you shouldn't be punished for that. What's your counter argument to that? And to the people who say you cannot completely plan out an economy, that itself could result in disaster. What's the pushback and the response to those arguments that we often hear?
Well, nobody brought up planning here. You brought up the P word. We're not talking about planning and control by the government and ownership by the government, which is what is often implied by planning. Here we're talking about a legal design, which our entire legal system is designed by lawmakers. That's why we call them lawmakers. And the job of the lawmaker is to produce an economic system, a legal system that produces economic prosperity, that produces justice and equity, hopefully do it in a sustainable, ecologically sustainable way, economically, socially sustainable way. So we tweak and we design the legal framework in order to produce these desirable outcomes. Now, of course, tweaking and designing the legal system means deciding from the get-go how we want the distribution of wealth that's been generated by this economy to take place. So we can design it with a tax rate that favors the top 1%. We can design it with a tax rate that's more equitable. We can design it so that wages are decent for workers so that they can afford food and housing and transportation and don't necessarily have to go into debt to go to college, don't have to go into debt, excessive debt to buy a house or to make a living. These are policy designs. It's not called planning. Planning is when we control people's lives and tell them what to eat and what to buy and from where to work and so on. Nobody's talking about that. We're talking about having a democratic system, a government of the people, by the people, for the people, which is what democracy is supposed to be, that serves the interest of the people as a whole in a fair and just and equitable way. And distribution, which I emphasize and call pre-distribution, is a very important component, a core principle in our democracy. And unfortunately, we've lost track of that very important feature. And now we're playing catch up a little bit.
Gotcha. Professor, I want to thank you so much for coming on and sharing this unique perspective. We greatly appreciate the discussion, for you diving into some of the details here. We hope to have you back. I assume this issue is not going to be resolved overnight. And so I think we'll have the opportunity for many more conversations, God willing, inshallah. Until then, thank you so much. And assalamu alaikum.
Thank you for having me on the show.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone. Let me turn it back to Samana.
Thank you. That's all from our Chicago studios tonight. Thank you for tuning in. You can find previous episodes and more on our YouTube or Facebook. For more content, keep watching Muslim Network TV or visit muslimnetwork.tv. Salam and good night.